In last week's episode, I was cruising around in a small cove taking depth sounder measurements. I was trying to figure out if the cove was a place where I could anchor, especially during a storm. So today what I want to do is go a little more in depth and explain exactly what I was doing and why. The rule of thumb for how much anchor line to deploy for a given depth is 7 to 1. This ratio is called the anchor scope. So if your depth measurement is 10 feet using a 7 to 1 scope, you would deploy 70 feet of anchor line. Some people will say 5 to 1, and that might be okay in light winds or for a short duration, but the generally accepted rule of thumb is 7 to 1. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that the depth measurement should be taken from the point where the anchor line leaves the boat. Normally, that's where the line comes over the deck, or on larger boats, it may be where the line exits the hull. In my case, it's at the deck level near this horn cleat where I tie off my anchor line, which is 2 feet above the waterline. Another consideration is how you take your depth measurements. If you're using a depth sounder, you need to consider where the transducer is mounted or whether you set an offset. On my boat, the transducer sits just inside the hull up in the bow. Where the transducer sits is actually 6 inches below the waterline. Most depth sounders allow you to set a keel offset. If a keel offset is configured, the reading will then be the depth of water under the keel. So you'll need to add the total draft of your boat back to the depth sounder reading to get the true water depth. In my case, I didn't set the keel offset because my draft varies depending on whether the centerboard is up or down. So I just wanted my depth sounder to display a true depth measurement below the spot in the hull where it's mounted. With my depth readings, I know I need to add 6 inches to get true water depth. So you just need to be aware of where you are shooting your depth soundings from and how close they are to actual water depth measurements. Obviously, the deeper the water, the more space you need so the boat can rotate around the anchor with the appropriate scope. In order to anchor in a small cove or other confined space, it has to be shallow enough that you can still fit in that space with 360-degree clearance. Based on those different depth sounder readings, and then of course adding the 2 feet from the water line to where the anchor line leaves the deck, plus another 6 inches for where the depth sounder is sitting in the boat 6 inches below the water line, so 2.5 feet in total. If my depth sounder reading is 10 feet, then I add the 2.5 feet, that's 12.5 feet, and then I multiply that number by the desired scope of 7, and that determines the correct length of the anchor road using a 7 to 1 scope. So with my anchor road calculated for each location where I got a depth sounder reading, I can now calculate the approximate radius of the circle the boat would be rotating within if the wind shifted. I don't have charts for the remote mountain lake where I sail, so I use Google Maps to make measurements of the width of the cove in several spots and then plotted out the circle diameters at each of the points where I had depth sounder readings to see how they compare and to determine if it was a viable place to anchor. To measure distance in Google Maps, simply click on a spot on the map, then right-click and select Measure Distance. Then click on the opposite shore and it will give you a distance measurement in feet between the 2 points. When making your calculations, don't forget to account for the length of your boat and also leave some clearance from the shore to avoid any underwater hazards that may exist in the shallows near shore. Now, I sail on a lake with a constant water level, but if you sail in a tidal area, you'll have to think about how the depth of the water will change over time and calculate your scope accordingly. Also keep in mind that the shoreline and the size of the cove may change as the tide goes out. On this map, I've marked the approximate locations of my depth sounder measurements. Based on this, I can do the calculations for scope, which will give me the rough radius of the circle that my boat would be rotating around with the anchor at the center. So based on those measurements, I can figure out whether or not I can anchor there. For the mathematicians out there, I get it. The anchor has some slack and doesn't lay in a straight line, so using that as the radius of the circle is not precise, but it's a good approximation and it's close enough for our purposes. So now I can do the calculations for each point where I have a depth sounder reading and plot those circles on my map to figure out where I can and can't anchor in this particular cove. So based on all the calculations and plotting the circles, I determined that these locations are not going to work for anchoring the boat at a 7 to 1 scope. It's just too deep, and there's not enough clearance from the shoreline based on the amount of anchor line used. Now, I could use less scope or maybe go back and take more depth sounder readings in different parts of the cove, but I suspect the center of the cove is even deeper than the part that I surveyed. I could also anchor on the windward side and maybe hope that the wind doesn't shift, but that seems really risky considering the frequent wind shifts at my lake, especially during storms and squalls. Finally, I could consider maybe using 2 anchors, one at the bow and one at the stern, and anchor in the most shallow part of the cove with less scope or with the anchors on the shore. But then I risk, being pounded by waves on the beam, and if I need to reposition in a hurry, it's going to be really difficult to do that. There were, however, several shallower readings I got near the entrance to the cove, and these do provide enough space for anchoring at a 7-to-1 scope. This area provides less protection than the interior of the cove, of course, but there is some protection from a nearby island. So in the future, if I'm caught out in a storm, now I know where I can and can't anchor in this cove. Well, as always, I hope you found this helpful, and thanks for watching.